history of the UFC.
So you want to be an ultimate fighter?
I would hate to have to score this fight.
The double tap does what the he wants.
Once upon a time, if you said you were watching the fight, you were talking about boxing, the sweet science. Today, if you're watching the fight, you're more likely referring to mixed martial arts. That shift, it's because of the UFC. Thanks to the Ultimate Fighting Championship, MMA, a brutal combat sport once referred to as no holds barred, has evolved not only into mainstream entertainment, but into a global cultural phenomenon. And less than 3 decades removed from their first pay-per-view event, the UFC has become a commercial juggernaut, a multi-billion-dollar promotional outfit home to some of the most recognizable athletes on the planet. However, the UFC never could have soared to such incredible heights without the efforts of one intrepid champion. And no, we're not talking about Randy Couture or Anderson Silva or even Ronda Rousey. The UFC's most important and enduring champion will always be Dana White, the relentless hustler and visionary who tapped into the world's latent bloodlust and ultimately turned a niche combat sport into a cultural behemoth. This is the story behind Dana White and the UFC. As recently as the mid-1970s, mixed martial arts just wasn't a thing in North America. That was until Brazil's own Rorion Gracie and his family brought their unique form of jiu-jitsu, a combination of multiple martial arts used for close combat, to the United States in the late 70s. In their efforts to popularize what we now call Brazilian jiu-jitsu, the family produced a video series titled Gracie's in Action that featured various family members showcasing the art form and defeating fighters from various disciplines. That video series aroused intrigue from Art Davie, an advertising executive who had been keen to stage his own fighting tournament to determine conclusively which martial art reigned supreme. Davie ended up partnering with the Gracies to put on the tournament, a nationally televised pay-per-view event which they dubbed the Ultimate Fighting Championship. And on November 12, 1993, in a half-full arena in Denver, Colorado, the UFC was born.
8 street tough warriors wage combat in a battle where anything can happen and probably will.
UFC 1 featured 2 kickboxers, a savate fighter in Jared Goudreau, a karate expert, a boxer, a shoot fighter in Ken Shamrock, and even a sumo wrestler in Tila Tuli, all of whom faced off in a tournament-style event. Weight class didn't matter, size didn't matter, it was just go out and win the fight. In the end, it was Royce Gracie, a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt and brother of Rorion Gracie, who became the first ever UFC tournament champion, submitting all 3 of his opponents on the ground. The show was only meant to be a one-off, but after it unexpectedly generated nearly 90,000 pay-per-view purchases, Davie and the Gracies decided to hold another, and another, and another. But it was still hard to sell. After all, their tagline was, "There are no rules," and the matches showcased a level of brutality that North American audiences weren't accustomed to or even comfortable with. By 1996, the concern over UFC's brutality had reached the US Senate, specifically then Arizona Senator John McCain, who led a campaign to ban the UFC in all 50 states, likening the sport to human cockfighting. 36 states eventually enacted laws banning no-holds-barred fighting, including New York, which adopted the ban on the eve of UFC 12, which was supposed to be held in Niagara Falls. Instead, the company was forced to move their event to Alabama. In response to the growing legal red tape, the UFC modified their rules to adhere to the laws of the athletic commissions in each state, instituting weight classes while banning fish hooking, hair pulling, and eye gouges. By UFC 21, the promotion had established unified rules, banning kicks to the head of a downed opponent, headbutting, and also introduced 5-minute rounds to make it more of a sporting affair and less like ungoverned violence. By that point, Rorion Gracie had long since divested himself from the promotion, having grown increasingly displeased with the company's disorganization, as had Davie. The 2 co-founders sold their stakes to the promotion's TV partner SEG, but the new ownership group didn't have any answers to the company's financial woes either. While the events continued to generate decent crowds and a healthy number of pay-per-view purchases, the UFC nevertheless remained a money pit. Ultimately, as incredible a spectacle and phenomenon it was, the UFC was failing commercially. If it was ever going to be more than a controversial niche sport, it needed a devoted, relentless champion to push it to the next level. And as fate would have it, that champion was about to come along. Dana White's wild journey to UFC head honcho began in the late 60s in Manchester, Connecticut. He was forced to grow up fast, as his father was an alcoholic who, as White put it, was never around, and his mother worked multiple jobs to support Dana and his sister Kelly. The family moved around a lot through White's childhood, bouncing back and forth between Boston, Connecticut, and Vegas. It was in Sin City that an adolescent White befriended Lorenzo Fertitta, a schoolmate of his at Bishop Gorman High School, that is, until White got expelled for upsetting the nuns. We'll get to Fertitta a little later. Growing up, White developed an affinity and an appreciation for fighting. He began boxing at the age of 17, though he never amounted to much in the ring. He started college twice, first at Quincy College and then at the University of Massachusetts, but White ended up dropping out of both schools and began working odd jobs to make ends meet, including working as a valet at a luxury hotel where he and his co-workers would often fight to determine who got the bulk of their tips. But eventually, White decided to commit to his dream of working and fighting. He began learning the ins and outs of the industry from former Golden Glove champion Pete Welsh, a Boston boxing legend, and eventually, White began giving boxing lessons out of his basement. That business grew, and White began renting out local gyms to hold lessons. White was making a name for himself, locally, but it didn't come without hiccups.
When I was 21 years old, I lived in Boston, and I got jumped one night at this bar, and these dudes beat the living shit out of me for about a good 20 minutes. 20 minutes, literally, until the police came. And at one point, I remember I was on one knee, and this fucking guy must have punched me in this ear 1,000 times. You know?
My God.
You know, and I was getting kicked and hit from all kinds of different directions. The guys were from Charlestown. I'm lucky I didn't get stabbed. I'm lucky I got the shit beat out of me.
The vicious assault had a lasting impact. White suffered permanent hearing loss and ear damage, which resulted in Meniere's, a disease that can cause vertigo-like symptoms. White lived with those symptoms for years before undergoing stem cell therapy that, as he put it, cured him 100%. As it turned out though, the assault was only the beginning of White's problems. As White's successful Boston boxer-sized business continued to grow, it caught the attention of the notorious Winter Hill Gang, led by the infamous Whitey Bulger, who was famously portrayed by Johnny Depp in the 2015 movie Black Mass. As White tells it, one day, two of Bulger's enforcers stopped one of White's boxing classes and demanded he pay $2,500 or else. At first, White didn't take their demands seriously. That is, until he received a call from Bulger's right-hand man Kevin Weeks saying that he had until 1 p.m. the next day to cough up the money. Fearing for his life, White packed his bags and immediately bought a one-way ticket to Las Vegas. Remember that Fertitta fellow I brought up earlier? Well, he and his brother Frank became casino owners in the Vegas area right around the time White arrived in Nevada. As it happens, the trio crossed paths again at a wedding, where the Fertittas asked if they could train with White, who had transitioned his successful boxer-sized business over to Vegas. The three started to train together, and before long, White asked an old acquaintance, John Lewis, another prominent Vegas area trainer, to join their group. Lewis, however, brought something different to the table. He was a mixed martial artist and UFC fighter himself, and had actually competed in UFC 22 and 28. By training with Lewis, White and the Fertitta brothers fell in love with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which Lewis had a black belt in. They became obsessed with MMA and would train constantly, sometimes 3 or 4 times a week. Through these sessions, White began to develop relationships with the fighters Lewis trained with, including Chuck Liddell, Tito Ortiz, Randy Couture, and BJ Penn. Soon enough, the ever-entrepreneurial White started serving as a manager for Lewis, Liddell, and Ortiz, handling their dealings with the UFC. Through representing a couple of the UFC's biggest stars, White began to learn the inner workings of the promotion. He would oftentimes find himself attending events and thinking of ways to improve the product. Once, while negotiating a contract, he gained access to the UFC's financial files and found out that the company, SEG, was going bankrupt and that its owner, Bob Meyrowitz, was looking to sell. White approached the Fertitta brothers to see if they were interested, and they jumped at the opportunity, offering up $2 million to purchase the UFC. In January of 2001, Meyrowitz accepted. The Fertitta brothers ultimately purchased a 90% stake, leaving White a 10% share in the company, albeit with the lofty title of president. As excited as they all were, however, they had their work cut out for them. After all, they had just bought a failing company that had relinquished all of its assets to avoid bankruptcy. Essentially, all that White and the Fertitta brothers had acquired was the UFC brand name and an old octagon. As dismal as their outlook was, though, White and the Fertitta brothers were about to birth a sporting empire. Despite the considerable legwork done by its previous owners, the UFC still wasn't respected as a promotional brand at the turn of the century. During White's early years, the company struggled on multiple fronts, unable to secure pay-per-view events, beset with legal and regulatory obstacles, and held back by an image problem stemming from the extreme violence of the sport, which made it exceedingly difficult to nail down sponsorships. By 2004, the Fertitta brothers had poured over $40 million into the company, and it still hadn't turned profitable. As White recalled years later, the brothers were itching to get out at that point, and Lorenzo even asked White to suss out how much they could get for the company. The brothers, along with White, threw up a Hail Mary to salvage their investment and legitimize the UFC, forking over another $10 million to produce a reality TV show titled The Ultimate Fighter. Pay-per-view events limited how many viewers they could reach, but mixed martial arts on cable TV? Now that could be a game changer. The show pitted two teams of aspiring fighters against each other, with Liddell and six-time champion Couture captaining each side. The team of fighters would live together in shared housing, train together under the guidance of their respective captains, and ultimately battle it out against the opposing team in a tournament-style event. The last man standing would get a six-figure contract with the UFC. It was entertaining television, but it was still a tough sell to networks. Eventually, however, Spike TV, a channel that specifically catered to a young male audience, agreed to sign on. They even slotted it right after WWE's Monday Night Raw, hoping that the synergy would create some spillover. Well, it worked. The show became an instant success, raking in over 1 million viewers for its first episode. The fighters and the fights were compelling, but one of the show's key hooks was White himself, who would occasionally come on the show to stir things up. The momentum continued to build, and the first season concluded with the UFC's first ever fight on cable TV between Forrest Griffin and Stephan Bonnar. To many, that is one of the greatest fights of all time. It's also the fight that saved the UFC. It was an incredible back and forth, with two guys who were standing up and exchanging blows for the majority of the fight. Griffin ended up winning, but both him and Bonnar were offered UFC contracts. Immediately following the fight, Spike TV and the UFC renewed for a second season, agreeing to terms on a napkin. More than a decade and a half later, The Ultimate Fighter has yet to be canceled. White and the Fertitta brothers' Hail Mary had worked. The show had successfully thrust MMA and the UFC into the mainstream. From there, the UFC's popularity exploded, and the promotion grew exponentially. In 2007, the UFC purchased its longtime rivals and biggest competitors, Japan-based Pride Fighting Championship, for $70 million. 4 years later, they acquired another competitor, Strikeforce, which helped them pave the way for fighters like Ronda Rousey, Daniel Cormier, Robbie Lawler to become UFC fixtures. And with each acquisition, the UFC wasn't merely adding to its arsenal of fighters and catalog of archival fights. It was consolidating its power and further solidifying itself as the premier promotion in the sport. And boy did it pay off. In 2011, the UFC reached a 7-year, $100 million deal with Fox Sports to broadcast their events. Since, the sport has turned into a global phenomenon. They've held fights in countless countries around the world, including China, Canada, Australia, the United Arab Emirates, Chile, and nearly 20 more outside of the United States. UFC fighters, meanwhile, have become international superstars, like from Rousey to Anderson Silva to George St. Pierre to Conor McGregor to Khabib Nurmagomedov to Francis Ngannou. The list goes on and on. The UFC's massive popularity also turned White into a star in his own right, and the UFC's popularity had grown meteorically, to the point where White and the Fertitta brothers agreed to sell the promotion to WME-IMG, a talent agency based in California, for a staggering $4 billion in 2016. It was the largest and most expensive sale of a sports organization in history.
I can tell you this, and this is the honest to God truth. When this deal closed, it bugged me out a little bit.
Why?
I don't know. It just, you know, when you make that kind of money, and your parent, you know, my partners, I've been with them for 20 years.
Right.
So that's all going to change. I have new partners now, yeah, it's kind of Howard Hughes myself up into a hotel room for a couple days.
Yeah, really.
Didn't sleep or eat. It kind of freaked me out a little bit.
Do you have people asking you for money already?
Oh yeah. Oh
yeah.
It's
relatives
crazy.
coming out of the woodwork.
I don't answer any family phone calls at all.
In 2018, the UFC also inked a $1.5 billion deal with ESPN to become its official TV partner, helping broadcast 30 of its Fight Night events on its networks, while also streaming 20 other events on the company's streaming service ESPN+. Their growth wasn't without speed bumps though. The promotion caught fire in the mid-2010s for rampant performance-enhancing drug use, with multiple fighters claiming that over 80% of the UFC had used PEDs of some kind. More recently, the UFC has faced criticism for not paying their fighters a fair proportion of revenue. In the mid-2000s, fighters reportedly received a 40% cut of the promotion's revenue. By 2022, that figure had reportedly plummeted to 16%. And who has been at the front of both controversies? Dana White. He has taken the brunt of blame publicly and has, to some fighters, become public enemy number one. When asked about fighter wages in 2021, White was defiant, flippantly noting that anyone is free to start their own MMA promotion and pay their fighters whatever they want. Still, while some may bristle at White's decision or his demeanor, it's that same acumen and tenacity that helped him become the face of the UFC and remain the most recognizable figure in the sport for 20 plus years. And in that time, he helped turn a niche combat sport that was compared to human cockfighting into a worldwide cultural phenomenon, all while transforming a nearly bankrupt promotional company into a premium, globally recognized brand worth billions of dollars. And despite the bumps in the road, there's no denying the seismic impact that the UFC had on the world of combat sports and sports entertainment. Thanks for watching. If you like this video and want to see more content like this, hit that subscribe button.